With Hyper-V, you're going to have multiple VMs on a single host, and resource management, the memory and the processing management across those VMs becomes very important. And we're going to get started with dynamic memory and managing the memory across multiple machines. But before we start, I want to take you on a brief tour. First of all, here's the server that we created at the very beginning. I also created a Gen 1 server. And the reason I created a Gen 1 is I want to show you some of the differences between them as we examine some of the settings. Now, dynamic memory is going to be configured in the settings portion of this VM. How do you get to that? Well, you can right-click on the VM and go to settings. Also, you'll notice some other options that are available, and we have different places where you can get to these same options. You can start the VM, and once it's started, you'll have options to stop it and pause it. You can checkpoint the VM, which is taking a snapshot of it at that point in time. You can move it to another machine or export it so that it can be moved to another machine. You can rename it, of course, deleting it. Enabling replication isn't something that we do in this series of the 410, but replication is where two VMs are maintained to be the same. You also can get to these settings over here. You have the same settings listed for that VM. Now, if you connect to a VM, mine's not running right now, so most of the things are grayed out. But you can hit the Control-Alt-Delete so you can log into it. You can start it, stop it, pause it. You can still snapshot it. There's the pause and reset it. So these options are something you want to spend some time with, getting comfortable using. Now, let's go look at the settings. First of all, I'm going to open my Gen 2 VM. So I'm going to go to settings, open that up. I'm going to kind of move this over here. And I'm also going to go to server 2, which is a generation 1 VM. And I wanted you to see, or have a chance to see, some of the differences between them. So let me slide this over and I'll get the other one up. And as you can see right away, as a matter of fact, let me bring this pretty close over here. Just by glancing, the initial list of the hardware list is going to be different. On the left over here is the generation 1. And remember, I was saying that you had things like COM ports and legacy devices, even a diskette drive. You don't have those in a generation 2, so you can immediately see that there is going to be a difference. Also, on the bottom, there are some management options, several of these that we'll be taking a look at throughout the rest of this module. Now, if you take a look here at Add Hardware, and I'm going to slide the Generation 2 VM settings a little bit to the right over here, I want you to notice that the hardware settings, you have things like a SCSI controller, network adapter, fiber channel adapter that you can add. You have those same things over here on the Generation 1, but you also have legacy adapters, and you might need these for that particular VM. We also have something that we'll talk about later called Remote FX to enhance your video support. You can tell by looking at the list that the firmware option is going to be different. On the Gen 2, we have a firmware option. Is Secure Boot, as I had mentioned earlier, is already enabled, and the order in which things are going to be booted, whether it's going to be a PXE boot, hard drive boot, that kind of thing. Now, over on the Generation 1, that's different. You've got BIOS settings, and this is the traditional BIOS and the order and sequence that you want to have. Some things between Generation and Generation 2 are going to be the same, because here's where we're going to focus on, is dynamic memory. And this dynamic memory settings page is going to be the same as the Generation 2. You also have a way that you can balance or resource manage your processors, specify the number of virtual processors, and then you can kind of balance those with other VMs, and those settings are going to be the same. Now, individual hardware is going to be slightly different for the VMs because Generation and Gen 2 type boxes. Now, those are the basic settings. And like I said, it's worth spending some quality time with these settings. Whether you're taking the exam for 7410 or if you're working with this in real life, it's good to get familiar between the differences of Generation 1 and Generation 2. We're going to focus on the memory management. And I'll just use the Generation 2 machine since the settings are the same. And we're going to focus on dynamic memory. Now, if you remember when I created this VM, I set a fixed amount of RAM this VM could have. That is its startup RAM. Now, here's what happens when a machine starts up. It's going to start up, it's going to load its drivers and start services. It requires quite a bit of resources just to get started, and then it quickly settles down. This is something you can watch through Performance Monitor and see that after the startup phase, that the VM will settle into kind of just a running mode. until users start to access it. Well, when you're using dynamic memory, we get the opportunity now to start to balance these kind of resource utilization for the memory. And the reason you want to do this is you're going to have multiple VMs on this host. Some VMs that are under higher load need higher amounts of memory. Some VMs under lower usage need lower amounts of memory. And since I have multiple VMs all trying to get that same memory pool, this is a way that we can allow the machines to dynamically balance that memory. So first of all, we have to enable it. Now from here, the settings can get a little bit confusing. It says, what's the minimum amount of RAM this VM can have? Well, this ties back to that startup amount. Remember, I was saying that when it starts up, it needs more resources to be able to load its drivers and its services, and then it settles down. Well, when it settles down, what's that minimum amount of RAM going to be? And the reason we're setting this minimum level is how much memory does it actually need to run after the startup. So if I need to take memory away, I can. Then we can specify the maximum amount of memory. Sometimes one of the challenges with a physical box is that it has a lot more memory in it than might actually be needed, and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, now we can monitor that with Performance Monitor and say, this box under its normal running environment, under its normal load, only needs, well, let's say 4 gig, 4096, since it's in megabytes. This has allowed us now to optimize this VM. It needs 1024 to start up, but then it can go down to 512 in its normal running state. But when it starts getting under load, it's going to go up to possibly 4 gig. It doesn't need any more than that, so don't reserve any more memory than that. That means that the overall memory pool for the host now has more RAM available for another VM. And this seems pretty straightforward, but you know what we like to do, especially on VMs that have quite a bit of load, is to create kind of a reserve. This is an additional amount of RAM that it tries to keep around whenever possible. And we do this as a percentage. So this percentage, this memory buffer percentage, will simply state that unless I have to give it away to someone else, I'd like to have the current amount of RAM that you're using plus a little bit more. This often improves overall response if the server suddenly gets more demand. Now, combining this memory buffer with the memory weight becomes a little tricky. And I'll be honest with you, this is something you're going to have to work with in real life when you're balancing out your VMs. Memory weight is how important is this VM in getting the RAM that it wants. And I think of it that way as that there are some virtual machines that it's okay if the server's a little slow. Users may not notice it, but there are going to be some VMs, possibly Exchange or your SQL Server, where those VMs need to have a higher priority on the memory that they want to use. Well, you can balance those between the different VMs on your host. Now, this VM that I have set up is a simple server with some SMB shares. It's okay if he's a little bit slower. In other words, he doesn't necessarily get all the RAM that he needs. So if somebody else that is of higher importance needs the memory, that memory will go to them. So you got to be careful when you're balancing out the weight, but it helps you prioritize which VMs get which memory. Now, this may seem at first like, oh, wow, it's a struggle here. And it is something that you're going to want to work with on your VMs to see where they perform. There's also a couple of cautionary notes that you should be aware of. Dynamic memory really is a great way to help optimize some of the VMs so you get better resource management of your memory. But some products don't work well with dynamic memory. And let me give you one example. Exchange 2013 is a great example, or any version of Exchange does not run well with dynamic memory. In fact, you hurt its performance by using dynamic memory. See, Exchange uses its memory to cache a lot of its operations. And if the memory is constantly changing, that cache doesn't get a chance to be accomplished. So where do you find that information out? You find it out from the actual products that you're working with. In the example that I just used of Exchange, they clearly state do not use dynamic memory for Exchange. So you want to make sure that you check those to see if they can work well with dynamic memory. For the most part, most VMs do, and this is a great way to do your resource management. Now that I have the settings that I want, let's go ahead and say OK. And let's start this VM and watch the assigned memory area. I'm going to start it, and it'll come up with that startup memory. So he can get through that startup phase, loading the drivers, services, everything that he needs. And then you'll notice that it'll change to that minimum amount of memory. And while the machine is starting up and it's doing that, let me show you the memory settings down here, because now you can see those memory settings of where its startup memory is, that dynamic is enabled, the minimum and maximum amounts, and what the current memory demands are on that machine. So shortly here, he will change down to 512. Oh, and there it goes. And so you can see that between my actual memory demand, now it's gone down to 512. 512 wasn't a bad assignment to make for that minimum memory. So that's how you can kind of see and monitor where your virtual machines are at. But you know, coming up next, we've got a couple of additional notes on this and smart paging.